Hi, everyone. My name is Adam, and this is with Privatize Your Life 101. The purpose of this video is to explain a little bit about the services that we have offered here and a bit about the mindset that goes into these services and how we can use them to put ourselves at an advantage in finance and in business. So, just to explain a little bit about my background, I started my personal development journey arguably back in high school, but more consciously about a decade ago when I decided that I wanted to have real financial freedom and be in control of my life. So, like many people, the first book I ever read was by Robert Kiyosaki, at least in this topic, and that was Rich Dad Poor Dad. And then from there, I went on to read hundreds of books in personal development and in finance, attend different seminars, work with different talented professionals, and also do a lot of other coursework on top of that. So, although I am not a bar member or a part of any kind of professional organization, like I'm not a CPA or an attorney, I am reasonably qualified to do what I do in business and in investment. And so I did want to bring you this video to enlighten you on a unique approach to bettering yourselves and bettering your life. So, one of the things that I began to do after learning quite a bit about the importance of taxes and business structures and all of that was to bring on very talented professionals in that sense. So I brought on some good attorneys, some good CPAs, and I found that I went really down a complex rabbit hole. So I learned quite a bit about complex tax strategies. I learned about complex business structures and that sort of thing. And I realized at a certain point that while all this was good, I was becoming more and more reliant on the system, which is actually what I was trying to get away from. So I found myself in a situation where I was reliant on these third-party professionals. And after certain events happened and certain situations I was involved in, I actually discovered that these third-party professionals were exposing me to risk and exposing me to liability that actually was slanted toward their benefit because those liabilities, if I had to deal with them, I would immediately have to go back to that third party professional to have them help me out with it. So I'm sure that not all third party professionals are that way, but it's something that everybody needs to be aware of and also know that the system that we're playing in is designed to make us think that we aren't smart enough or competent enough, and therefore we have to use these third party professionals who many times lead us down the wrong road, and it's at our expense. So, after more than a decade of successful investments in real estate, emerging technologies, building and purchasing existing e-commerce businesses, I began learning from some very successful small business entrepreneurs and other talented individuals with creative and unique backgrounds. So that's where I draw a lot of my experience and knowledge from. So the professionals that I was utilizing were making out very well from the amount I was paying them. And then I discovered that they actually weren't as knowledgeable as I once thought. And so I started to take things back and get control over them as well. So in the end, my approach is knowing and understanding what your private property rights are and how they work, but also how to protect them and to leverage them. So, furthermore, I found that receiving bad advice from the people that I was convinced I should trust and were the experts was not leading me to where I wanted to go. So, what is Privatize Your Life? Well, let's fast forward to the general approach, which is controlling your private property rights and ownership of property, just as the Constitution guarantees. So, what is the definition of ownership? Well, owning something is simply having the exclusive right to spend or sell an asset, a medium of exchange, or a transfer of value. So divesting our exclusive right to property, which can protect you from debt collectors, creditors, levies, or even lawsuits or judgment from lawsuits, is what we want to do here, as well as better managing of cash flow and also knowing how to use the different tax treatments for that cash flow. So moving our property rights or property over to a company with additional members or other innocent parties, okay, means that you no longer have the exclusive right necessarily to sell or spend that asset. And so that's sort of the general approach that we're dealing with here. So when you create an LLC, for instance, or a trust, depending on how it's written, you've basically created a new, like another legal person. It's just in the form of an entity. So LLCs are very useful tools. They can solve most of the problems that we deal with when it comes to income, business, ownership, but that's if you know how to use it properly. So LLCs, for instance, it's a great way to manage business cash flow and also manage personal cash flow. And that's another strategy that we help here. So as you probably heard before, the overall approach is to own nothing but control everything. And that is the approach that I can help you with. So the technical explanation to that is making a list of everything that you have the exclusive right to spend or sell, and understand that all those assets have some level of value, but that's also what makes them a liability as well, because that's what creditors go after. They go after that value. And part of the approach that we want to take here is to prevent or deflect potential litigation. I think that that's one of the biggest steps to not being involved in litigation. It's doing everything that you can to prevent it. And many times, depending on the legal counsel that you have or the legal advice you receive, you don't get that. So that's going to be one of the things that we do. So some people will even take out litigation insurance policies. And as their net worth increases, so too does the value of their litigation insurance policy. A lot of times that's what an attorney will actually recommend to their clients. But of course, you're getting your advice from an attorney at that point. So the recommendation would just be to cut off the liability by conveying the exclusive right to that property to another person or entity or a multi-person entity. So don't leave the things that are important to you, including cash flow, at risk. So I might have already touched on this, but understand that I am not a CPA or a bar member, aka an attorney, nor would I ever want to be. So I do realize, though, that there is a need for their service. I think that there is valuable services that they can provide, and that's something that we would eventually go over. I will have content that expands further on that. So the other thing is, I will never practice law per se, because that's going to lead to all sorts of different trouble. But if there's ever a situation that leads us to that, I would then refer you to the proper professional. And the good thing is that you wouldn't have to start everything from scratch, because you'd already have a starting place and you'd also know what questions to ask. So it's always good to not go to a professional throwing your hands up and saying, I don't know what to do. Can you please help me? Because I'm sure that they will definitely have a plan for you. And it's probably going to be very expensive. So, as far as services offered, now there's a number of things that we do. It has to do with different business, investment, asset protection, and just other creative ideas to leveraging your personal private property rights. So, first thing I would go over is obtaining business credit. I think that that is a very valuable thing that we can do. Dun Bradstreet is a tool that'll help you get your business credit set up, which is good to have personal, or actually, it's good to have business credit, because you are not providing a personal guarantee, or a PG, it's called. So this is a fantastic tool if you have less than stellar credit, or if you just simply don't want to be on the hook for having an additional loan on your balance sheet. So I think that that's at least your personal balance sheet, but that is one thing that I can help you with as well. Create that business credit, and then you can take it out and you can take loans that you have not personally secured, and you can put that right back into your business. So that's one of the things. Now, there's also different cash flow strategies. So I like to show people how they can make more money while they're doing what they're already doing. So, for instance, once you've eliminated some or all of the risk associated with your assets, as I mentioned earlier, and you've implemented some tax treatment strategies and some cash flow management approaches, all right, you might even want to begin a side hustle or some other kind of cash flow stream that'll help you make an additional 1 to 5K or maybe even as much as 20K per month. So it's not something that'll necessarily take an extra 40 hours a week of your time, but you could probably put in 3 to 5 hours a week working on something and see a potentially very large increase in your overall cash flow. So I do want to caution everyone though that it could still be very hard work and it may require additional funding in the future. So that's why we will be working on obtaining business credit in the meantime. But again, I don't want anyone to feel as though this is just some magic pill and you can just instantly start making quite a bit more per month. It is something that can take hard work, but it's something that is doable, especially if you already have committed 40 to 50 hours a week of your time working on a career or a business already. So that's one of the approaches. Another thing that I'll do is I'll throw out different ideas that I think are important in principle. So, in general, instead of paying a debt off like most people try to do, I would have you consider acquiring a new asset to offset that debt by increasing your cash flow. So, I think that that's one way of just increasing your net worth and your means. And if you want to use that cash flow to pay off a specific debt, well, that's all great too. I mean, by all means, that's a good way to do it as well. But we need to start thinking in terms of not paying off existing debts, but rather increasing the amount of assets that we have to offset those debts, especially because inflation will end up paying off the lion's share of that debt. And again, that's something that we can talk about in the future as part of that content as well, and how all of this is interconnected. So as far as another service that's very important is dealing with the IRS and debt collectors, including lawsuits coming from third-party debt collectors. So if you're having debt collection problems or if the IRS is coming after you, I can help connect you to non-attorney specialists. They're worth their weight in gold. They've been doing this for decades and they help people get through without paying anything and actually beating them in the lawsuit and sometimes even countersuing and receiving a judgment because let's say a third party got their information from somebody else that they didn't authorize and they got them on a form of identity theft. So there's all sorts of interesting and creative things that go on that, they don't like to have out in the public. And quite frankly, most people don't know and never will know. So that's another service there. And now going back, though, to the use of LLCs to manage risk and capital. So these LLC structures that we put in place, they've been used for decades. And they've originally started with somebody who is going to be receiving a financial windfall of some kind. So maybe selling or divesting interest in a business. Maybe they received some kind of inheritance or a substantial capital gain, or they're dealing on different matters of stocks. So now many people that I've been helping with, they want to get set up for cryptographic currencies and the management of those assets, which is actually a new asset class. But we want to manage the cash flow for the same reasons. And I know that many of you are interested in that, so I'm going to focus on that for a minute. But I will have future content about dealing with the post-windfall management and eventual reallocation of that capital that come from dealing with cryptographic currencies. But I'll just mention here that many people end up with erroneous 1099s from the exchange or the broker that they're using at the end of the tax period. And for instance, maybe somebody had Ethereum and they swapped it for Bitcoin. Well, that in and of itself is not a taxable event. However, the exchange will then send you a 1099, which will go to the IRS as well at the end of the year, which will force you to reconcile it unless you're able to show that it's erroneous. So I will show you how to make sure that we don't have an issue with those 1099s again, especially when dealing with simple swaps where you never went back into US dollars. So quite a bit of content on that. We can talk about that for days. So in the end, cryptographic currency, it's like a safe haven. It's like having gold or silver. And those aren't taxable unless you're selling into US dollars. But even then, there's plenty of nuances that go into that. And just by selling into US dollars doesn't necessarily mean that it's taxable either. These are some of the more advanced strategies that we will be talking about. So we can use the LLC as a pass-through entity, and that doesn't have to file a tax return. A pass-through entity does not necessarily have to file a tax return or a holding company. So that's what we're going to use on the exchange, as long as you account for any money that you take out for personal use. That should be put on your 1040 or your tax return as other income. You don't want to use a Schedule C for that because then the CPA will want to bring your corporation into that tax filing. So you can even use the account once you make a windfall, and you can then use another LLC that you fund directly with that without paying tax on that windfall if done correctly. So this is not a 1031 exchange or anything like that that you would see. That has its own requirement, by the way, in Title 26, which is the US tax code. So this is not a like-kind exchange, which is done through an escrow type service, but it's more of like a disqualified escrow service. And that's how we use it to use the different pass-through entities to move money around us without creating taxable events. So when we open up this account, I'll make sure that you have all of the documentation needed to get it open and answers to all of the questions that all of these third-party service providers are going to ask you. And mainly those third-party service providers are going to include the banks, brokers, or exchanges. Anyone else, when we get into real estate, we will talk about how to deal with title companies and attorneys and lenders, etc. But this is just simply for cryptographic currencies because of how popular it is and how many inquiries I get about it. So they'll ask you for things like, well, what is the website of your company? Or provide me an organizational chart. Other irrelevant other irrelevant questions that are associated with your LLC, particularly for the purposes of using cryptographic currencies to manage risk, which is really what we're doing. So another thing that you'll see us do is we'll use aliases or even a fake name associated with certain parts of your LLC or maybe even third-party accounts. So there's nothing illegal about it as long as we're putting it in the right places. And it's important to note that even the US Postal Service has forms that allows for people to use an alias even when it comes to their own mailbox. So another thing that we're going to delve into is which state would you like to organize in? So a lot of people have these ideas that different states are better to organize in because of charging order. Well, based on how we're going to set this up, it doesn't matter what state we're in, you'll still get the charging order protection. But the reason that we choose certain states and avoid other states has to do with how much those states leave you alone, whether or not there's red tape. The expense is another thing. So, for instance, we like New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, And we typically try to stay away from other states such as California, Illinois, Tennessee, and Texas. So that's just a little bit about that. But again, that's one of the main services and one of the most popular things that we do. Moving on to another service or content, which is going to be very valuable to many of you, and that's real estate. So I've been a successful residential real estate investor for at least a decade, and I've owned dozens of properties. That's across various states and jurisdictions. I've owned properties that range from little older houses in questionable neighborhoods and all the way to new construction, nice properties, and newly established neighborhoods. So I've done this in multiple states using different property managers, repair services, lenders, brokers, you name it. So just to give a little tidbit about the approach here when it comes to real estate, for those who don't know, there's three types of real estate markets in the US and probably in the world, but the three types include linear, cyclical, and hybrid markets. So linear markets, those are typically the slow and boring markets. You don't typically hear much about them in the news, and they aren't very volatile in terms of value or price associated with those properties. So they do appreciate, but slowly over time. But they also have a very solid rental pool with sustainable employment. So cyclical markets, they are the markets that you do hear about. So they're going to be generally located in the expensive Northeast markets, the West Coast, and South Florida. So these are typically associated with cyclical markets. There's large booms and busts. There's many times there is a lot of red tape and not very favorable uh, landlord laws as opposed to tenant laws. And so that's another thing to always take into account. And then, of course, you have your hybrid markets. And the hybrid markets are essentially a mix between those two. So you'll still have a strong employment market with maybe a little bit higher of a rental market as well. And the volatility associated with the price of the houses, it moves a little bit more than the linear markets, but it's not quite as volatile as the cyclical that we talked about. So that'll give you a little bit more of an appreciation play if that's what you're looking for. And example for some of those markets include Jacksonville, Florida, which we've had a lot of success in, and also the suburban areas of Atlanta, Georgia, for instance. So I've got extensive knowledge on how to get started and how to research, beginning from the state that you're going into, to the city, to the neighborhood, the street, and then eventually the actual property, and then running all of those numbers. So this is something that can be done on more of an hourly rate basis when it comes to consultation, but I also do have referrals for different people in the business should you need property management or brokers or real estate, I guess, realtors, that sort of thing. And then finally, the last thing I'll probably talk about here, and this is one that's growing in interest, and that is called the biometric security agreement. Okay, so the question is, how is your identifying information being collected, used, and stored? And do you have an idea how much of your data is being stolen from you and then dispersed to all different third parties? Okay, so intellectual property rights are well known in the US, and your identifying information is a very important intangible private property right that has the same legal significance as intellectual property. So if you look, for example, at the Motion Picture Association of America, which deals with Hollywood and all of that, they have spent lots of time and money lobbying Congress to make sure that the unauthorized use or duplication of their IP, their movies or their documentaries, whatever it may be, okay, that they have the ability to pursue any kind of criminal charges should anybody violate those rights. Okay, so it's very important. And the legal system will hold that up. It'll uphold all of that. Okay, so same thing as copyright privileges on a poem or a song. Your medical records, those are also considered to be very important intangible property rights. All right, so you have the right to impose a lien on these things as well. You also have the right to ask what will happen with that information and why. Very important things. All right, so you have property rights. You actually have property rights under USC, 26 USC of the US Tax Code, Section 6103. Okay, and this is why FinCEN couldn't require a business owner or somebody who owns business interest in a company were not required to send their beneficial owner information. I know a lot of people did. I did not because I could always stand behind 26 USC section 6103 for my privacy of my information and not having to disclose that to other government agencies. So this is the type of thing that you should start thinking about and how this works. The reason for all of this analogy is to show that we actually have the ability to put terms and conditions on the collection, use, and storage of our biometric and biographic information. It gives you a cause of action. It doesn't require you to wait for the Attorney General to do something, and you don't have to depend on a state statute for the right to privacy because you're establishing all of that in your biometric security agreement. So it's similar to having a mortgage, to be honest, except in this case, you become the lender. All right. And you basically get to give the terms and conditions of that using the Uniform Commercial Code or the UCC. And that's something that I will help you show you how to figure out and how to file and how to put it in the public record. So, why is this important? Well, the personal data industry is currently at about $100 billion in 2025 at the time of this recording, and it's still growing. All right, so the resources that are being put into collecting this type of data, it's outrageous. All right, and that should tell you that it's worth more than it seems, or it's worth more than what a lot of people believe. All right, so I also caution anyone from using facial recognition scans, fingerprints, anything like that, voice recognition with your devices or when dealing with a third party. All right. So they're selling it to you as though it's some level of convenience. All right. But they're selling it to whomever they want. And they're definitely not treating it with care. At least I don't think that they are. And then you don't know what those other third parties are doing with it. Look at how many hacks there are that take place, security breaches and hacks. I mean, whether these things are intentional or not, the fact of the matter is that if there's a third party that's holding your information and they're especially violating terms that you have already put on it, and something happens to it, either it gets into the wrong hands of somebody or it gets stolen or hacked, they should be on the hook for that. And that's part of what this biometric security agreement is. Also, if they're selling your data, okay, you are claiming it. That is your own. That's your own personal IP, and you don't need permission to claim it. So you need to understand that. I think that the collection is being done for nefarious purposes, okay? So it'll likely be used in hardware and software and different services. It'll rely on that facial recognition, the voice recognition, your fingerprint and your hand geometry. Okay. Iris scans. These are all things that they're going to be pushing for more and more, and they're making a ton of money on it. And you should be able to claim, uh, at the very least, a portion of that revenue. So, at the least, if you don't claim your data, okay, and it gets passed around to the highest bidder, all right, and you're not claiming it, it's being treated as though it is abandoned property. All right, so this is going to give you the ability to do that. All right. Another thing that's important to consider is that when we deal with the prospect of social credit scores and a social credit system, or even a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, being tied to your biometric data, well, this is a way to fight back. Okay, this is a way to actually beat it. If you and other people you knew were to do this and it really blazed a path and gained some steam, it could be extremely powerful. So, long story short, I will teach you to file a biometric security agreement with the UCC and put the organization's legal counsel on notice. All right. Also showing them that they have been put on notice at the very least. So I think that that's a great place to stop, or to at least to end the video. It should be enough to explain what my mentality is, where I came from, and what we're looking to do. So based on this, I'm hoping that some of my approach and services could be helpful and valuable to you. And it'll be great to talk with you in the near future. Thanks.